met Ethan Howard at a motorbike rental shop in Hat Yai 3 years ago. And what I'm about to tell you will make you question everything you think you know about trust, love, and the lengths people will go to exploit human vulnerability. This isn't just another travel horror story. This is about how a successful, intelligent man became the perfect victim in a web of deception so sophisticated that even now, knowing the truth, I sometimes wonder if there were signs we all missed. Before we dive into this psychological maze, I need you to subscribe to this channel because stories like these need to be heard. And trust me, what happened to Ethan will stay with you long after this video ends. Ethan Howard was 53 years old when I first shook his weathered hand in that cramped rental shop. The air thick with motor oil and the humid breath of southern Thailand. He had the kind of face that told stories without words. Deep lines around his eyes spoke of decades spent squinting into Canadian prairie sunsets, managing his logistics company. His divorce had been finalized 18 months earlier. 26 years of marriage dissolved in courtroom paperwork, leaving him with a comfortable settlement, an empty house in Calgary, and a profound loneliness that seemed to seep from his very pores. He wasn't running from his problems when he booked that first trip to Thailand. He was methodically, systematically trying to rebuild himself. Ethan approached healing the same way he approached business, with spreadsheets and 5-year plans. Thailand represented phase 2 of his post-divorce recovery. Phase 1 had been therapy, gym memberships, and awkward dinners with coupled friends who didn't know how to navigate his new single status. Phase 2 was adventure, cultural immersion, and what his therapist had gently suggested might be appropriate companionship when he felt ready. The man I met that sweltering afternoon in Hat Yai was genuinely trying to reinvent himself. He'd researched Thailand extensively, not just the tourist traps, but the real Thailand. He'd learned basic Thai phrases, studied the cultural nuances, even practiced proper greeting gestures in front of his bathroom mirror back home. This wasn't some middle-aged sex tourist looking for cheap thrills. This was a man genuinely seeking connection and meaning in the second act of his life. What made Ethan particularly vulnerable wasn't his loneliness, though that certainly played a part. It was his fundamental decency. After 26 years in a marriage where communication had slowly eroded into polite coexistence, he craved genuine human connection with an intensity that bordered on desperation. He wanted to matter to someone again. He wanted to feel needed, desired, important. These aren't shameful desires. They're deeply human ones. But in the wrong hands, they become weapons. Orasa appeared in Ethan's life like something out of a romantic movie. And that should have been the first red flag. Real love rarely arrives with perfect timing and cinematic lighting. But when you're 53, recently divorced, and sitting alone in a coffee shop in Hat Yai, feeling like the loneliest man in Southeast Asia, you don't question miracles. You just thank whatever gods might be listening and hold on tight. She was 28, with long black hair that caught the afternoon light streaming through the cafe windows. And when she smiled at Ethan from across the room, it wasn't the practiced smile of someone working an angle. At least that's what he told himself later. It was shy, genuine, with just enough uncertainty to make his protective instincts kick into overdrive. She was having trouble with her laptop. He could see her frowning at the screen, occasionally sighing in frustration. Ethan had always been a problem solver, in business, in marriage, in life. When he saw someone struggling, his first instinct was to help. So when Orasa looked up and caught him watching, when she gave him that helpless little shrug that seemed to say, "I'm completely lost here," he didn't hesitate to approach her table. Her English was better than his Thai, but not by much, and their conversation was a delightful mixture of broken sentences, hand gestures, and shared laughter over mutual linguistic struggles. She was studying to be a nurse, she told him, working part-time at a local clinic while taking evening classes. Her family lived in a village outside Hat Yai. Traditional people who wouldn't understand her friendship with a foreign man. This need for discretion felt romantic to Ethan, like they were characters in some forbidden love story. The laptop problem was simple. A virus had corrupted some of her school files, and she was panicking about an assignment due the next day. Ethan spent the better part of 2 hours helping her recover the documents, showing her basic computer maintenance, even buying her dinner while they worked. By the time her laptop was fixed, something else had been repaired too. The crushing loneliness that had followed Ethan across the Pacific Ocean seemed to have lifted, replaced by something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. Let me pause here for a moment. Before we continue with what happened next, I want you to stop this video and write in the comments what seems suspicious to you about this story so far. What warning signs are you picking up that Ethan missed? Because I guarantee you're seeing things that a lonely, vulnerable man, desperate for connection, might have overlooked. Go ahead, pause the video and share your thoughts. I'm genuinely curious what your instincts are telling you. The courtship, if you could call it that, moved with a speed that should have terrified anyone thinking clearly. But Ethan wasn't thinking clearly. He was feeling deeply and intensely for the first time in years. Within a week of meeting Orasa, they were spending every evening together. She would finish her shift at the clinic and meet him at small, out-of-the-way restaurants where the other customers wouldn't stare at the unlikely couple. Orasa was everything his ex-wife hadn't been in the final years of their marriage. She was interested in his stories, asked thoughtful questions about his business, laughed at his jokes even when they didn't quite translate. More importantly, she seemed to need him. She would call him when she was having problems with difficult patients at the clinic, seeking his advice. She would ask him to help her practice English, hanging on every correction he offered. She made him feel valuable again. The first warning sign came disguised as intimacy. 3 weeks into their relationship, Orasa broke down crying over dinner. Her mother was sick, she told him through tears. Very sick. The family couldn't afford the proper medical treatment. And Orasa was working extra shifts just to help with the basic medications. She wasn't asking him for money. She was careful to emphasize that. She was just scared and needed someone to talk to. Ethan's response was immediate and generous. He offered to pay for her mother's treatment, to fly in specialists if necessary. Orasa protested, insisted she couldn't accept such generosity from someone she'd known for such a short time. But her gratitude was overwhelming. And when she finally, reluctantly accepted his offer to cover the medical expenses, the way she looked at him made Ethan feel like a hero. The second warning sign was her sudden availability. Orasa had initially been careful about their relationship, insisting they meet secretly, worried about her reputation and her family's reaction. But after Ethan's generous offer regarding her mother's medical bills, she began spending entire nights with him. She moved some of her belongings into his hotel room. She started talking about their future together, about maybe visiting Canada someday, about how different their life could be. Ethan was intoxicated by this rapid intimacy. After years of emotional distance in his marriage, Orasa's apparent devotion felt like validation that he was still capable of being loved. He extended his stay in Thailand indefinitely. He started looking into visa requirements for bringing Orasa to Canada. He began mentally redecorating his empty Calgary house, imagining how it would look with her belongings mixed in with his. The financial requests started small and seemed entirely reasonable. Orasa's visa application required certain fees. There were English classes she wanted to take to improve her chances of finding work in Canada. Her family needed help with some unexpected expenses related to her mother's ongoing treatment. Each request came with detailed explanations, official-looking documents, and profound gratitude. Ethan never questioned them, because questioning would have meant acknowledging that this perfect relationship might not be what it seemed. By the end of his second month in Hat Yai, Ethan had transferred over $15,000 to various accounts associated with Orasa and her family. He didn't consider this unusual or concerning. He was planning to marry this woman after all. Her problems were becoming his problems. Her family was becoming his family. This is what love looked like, he told himself. This is what partnership meant. The dependency wasn't just financial, though that was certainly part of it. Orasa had become the center of Ethan's entire existence in Thailand. She chose their restaurants, planned their activities, decided how they spent their time together. When she was working at the clinic, Ethan found himself unable to enjoy anything. He would sit in his hotel room, counting the hours until she would return, checking his phone obsessively for her messages. More troubling was how she had begun to isolate him from other potential connections. When Ethan mentioned conversations he'd had with other expatriates in Hat Yai, Orasa would become withdrawn and jealous. She would suggest that these other foreigners were probably involved in unsavory activities, that Ethan was too trusting, too good-hearted to recognize when people might be taking advantage of him. The irony of this warning, coming from her, would only become apparent much later. She had also begun monitoring his communications with family and friends back home. Not overtly, not in any way that seemed controlling at the time. She would simply be present whenever he made calls, would ask detailed questions about his conversations, would offer opinions about what his family members were really trying to say. Gradually, Ethan found himself sharing less and less about his relationship with Orasa when he spoke to people back home. It was easier to avoid their questions than to try to explain something that was becoming increasingly difficult to define. The psychological manipulation was so subtle that even now, knowing everything that happened, I can barely trace its progression. Orasa had identified exactly what Ethan needed: loneliness and purpose and validation. And she had provided all of these things in carefully measured doses. But she had also made herself indispensable in ways that went far beyond emotional support. She had become his translator, his cultural guide, his connection to everything authentic about his Thai experience. Without her, he was just another lost tourist stumbling through a country he didn't understand. The truth began to unravel on a Tuesday evening in his third month in Hat Yai. And it started with something as simple as a wrong phone number. Ethan had been trying to call Orasa at the clinic where she claimed to work, wanting to surprise her by booking a weekend trip to the islands. But when he called the number she'd given him, the person who answered had never heard of anyone named Orasa. Not only that, but the clinic he described didn't match their location or services. At first, Ethan assumed it was a simple miscommunication. Language barriers, similar clinic names. Maybe Orasa worked at a different location than he'd understood. But something about the conversation nagged at him. And for the first time since meeting Orasa, he decided to do a little investigating on his own. The clinic where Orasa claimed to work didn't exist at the address she'd given him. The address led to a small electronics repair shop, whose elderly owner became very animated when Ethan described Orasa. He knew her all right. She came by regularly with different foreign men, always claiming to work at various medical facilities around the city. The shop owner seemed genuinely concerned for Ethan, explaining in broken English that many local women targeted tourists, especially older men traveling alone. Ethan's world began collapsing with the weight of undeniable evidence. The nursing school where Orasa claimed to be studying had no record of her enrollment. The family emergency involving her sick mother, the one that had cost him thousands of dollars in medical expenses, couldn't be verified through any of the hospitals in the region. Even their relationship, which had felt so private and special, turned out to be painfully public. Several local business owners recognized Ethan's description of Orasa and their activities together. The most devastating discovery came when Ethan finally worked up the courage to hire a local private investigator. Orasa wasn't just running a romance scam on him. She was simultaneously involved with at least 3 other foreign men, all of whom believed they were in exclusive relationships with her, all of whom had been contributing financially to various fabricated emergencies and future plans, all of whom were being systematically deceived by someone who had turned emotional manipulation into a profitable career. But here's where this story takes a turn that even I didn't see coming. And I thought I'd heard every possible variation of this particular nightmare. The confrontation Ethan had been planning, the careful presentation of evidence and demand for explanations never happened, because on the night he discovered the truth about Orasa, she discovered that he had discovered the truth about her. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, because what happens next will redefine everything you think you know about this story. And I want you to leave a comment telling me whether you've ever heard of anything similar happening to someone you know, because what happened to Ethan that night goes far beyond simple romance fraud. Ethan returned to his hotel room that evening, exhausted and heartbroken, carrying a folder full of evidence that proved everything about his relationship with Orasa had been a lie. He was planning to pack his belongings, book a flight home, and try to rebuild his life yet again. He was prepared for tears, denials, maybe even threats. What he wasn't prepared for was finding 4 men waiting in his room. They weren't hotel security or police. They were young, muscular, and had the kind of casual menace that comes from years of experience in violence. Orasa was there too, but she wasn't the gentle, vulnerable woman Ethan had fallen in love with. She was cold, businesslike, completely in control of the situation. When she spoke to the men, it was in rapid Thai that Ethan couldn't follow, but her tone was that of someone giving orders, not someone seeking protection. The leader of the group, a man with facial scars and gold teeth who seemed to find the entire situation amusing, spoke to Ethan in surprisingly good English. They knew he had been asking questions around town, he said. They knew he had hired someone to investigate Orasa. They knew he had discovered her business arrangement with other foreign men. This was a problem, because it interfered with ongoing operations. But they weren't there to hurt him. The man assured Ethan, with a smile that was somehow more terrifying than any threat could have been. They were there to make him a business proposition. Ethan had two choices. He could continue causing problems, in which case his wife back in Canada would receive detailed photographs and videos of his activities in Thailand, along with documentation of every dollar he had spent on his Thai girlfriend. His divorce settlement included a morality clause that would cost him significantly if evidence of infidelity emerged, or he could become a silent partner in their operation. He would continue his relationship with Orasa, continue providing financial support, and additionally begin paying a monthly fee to ensure his discretion. In exchange, they would guarantee his safety, protect his reputation back home, and allow him to maintain the illusion of the relationship he had thought he wanted. The room fell silent except for the hum of the air conditioning and Ethan's labored breathing. Everything he had thought he understood about his situation had just shifted again. This wasn't just romance fraud. This was organized crime, and he wasn't just a victim anymore. He was being recruited, but Ethan Howard hadn't built a successful logistics company by backing down when things got complicated. And he hadn't survived the devastation of his divorce by accepting defeat quietly. The men in his hotel room had made a critical miscalculation. They assumed that fear would make him compliant, that shame would make him cooperative. They didn't understand that sometimes, when you've lost everything that matters to you, fear becomes irrelevant. Ethan looked at Orasa, really looked at her, maybe for the first time since they'd met. The woman who had made him feel alive again, who had given him purpose and hope and something to look forward to. She met his gaze steadily, without apology or explanation. In her eyes, he saw not hatred or cruelty, but something worse, complete indifference. He had never mattered to her at all. He had been nothing more than a job, a source of income, a mark to be worked until he was no longer profitable. That's when Ethan smiled. It wasn't a pleasant smile, and it seemed to unnerve the men who had been so confident in their control of the situation, because Ethan had just realized something that changed everything. These people had made their living by exploiting emotional attachment, by weaponizing love and loneliness, and the human need for connection. But they had also just freed him from every emotional attachment he had to this situation. They had shown him exactly who Orasa really was, and in doing so, they had given him something more valuable than all the money he had lost. They had given him clarity. Ethan told them he needed time to think about their offer. Just until tomorrow morning, he said. He would meet them at the same restaurant where he and Orasa had shared their first dinner, and he would give them his decision then. The scarred man seemed surprised by this calm response, but agreed to the timeline. After all, where could Ethan go? What could he do? He was one middle-aged foreigner in a city where he didn't speak the language, up against people who clearly had extensive local connections. What they didn't know was that Ethan had spent the last 3 months learning much more about Hat Yai than just the best restaurants and tourist attractions. His methodical, business-oriented approach to understanding Thailand had included research into local law enforcement, expatriate communities, and legal resources available to foreign nationals. And his investigative work over the past few days had put him in contact with people who could help him in ways his extortionists couldn't imagine. The next morning, Ethan arrived at the restaurant precisely on time. But he wasn't alone. He was accompanied by 2 officers from the tourist police, a representative from the Canadian consulate, and the private investigator he had hired, who turned out to have extensive connections with local law enforcement. The investigator had been documenting not just Orasa's activities, but the entire criminal network she was part of. Ethan's case had provided the final pieces of evidence needed to bring down an operation that had been targeting foreign tourists for years. The confrontation was swift and decisive. The same men who had seemed so menacing in Ethan's hotel room suddenly looked very young and very scared when faced with official government attention and the prospect of serious criminal charges. Orasa, who had been so composed and controlled during their previous encounter, broke down completely when she realized the scope of the investigation and her own legal exposure. But the real surprise came when the authorities revealed the full extent of what they had uncovered. Ethan hadn't just been targeted randomly. His divorce, his financial situation, even his travel plans had all been researched in advance. The meeting at the coffee shop, Orasa's computer problems, even the specific type of help she had needed. It had all been carefully orchestrated. She had been watching him for days before their first conversation, learning his patterns, identifying his vulnerabilities. The criminal network had developed sophisticated methods for identifying and targeting lonely, financially stable foreign men. They monitored divorce records, tracked travel bookings, even maintained social media profiles designed to identify potential marks. Ethan's profile as a recently divorced businessman traveling alone had made him an ideal target from the moment he arrived in Thailand. Over the following weeks, as the legal process unfolded, Ethan learned details about the operation that both horrified and fascinated him. The group had been running multiple concurrent romance scams, sometimes using the same women with different identities, sometimes coordinating complex scenarios involving fake families and fabricated emergencies. They had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from foreign tourists over the past several years. But perhaps most disturbing was how effectively they had been able to manipulate their victims' emotions and decision-making processes. Many of the men they had targeted had been intelligent, successful individuals who would never have fallen for obvious financial scams. But loneliness and the desire for human connection had made them vulnerable in ways they hadn't recognized. Ethan remained in Hat Yai for 6 weeks, while the legal proceedings continued. But his relationship with the city was entirely transformed. Instead of hiding in his hotel room, he became actively involved in the expatriate community. He volunteered with organizations that provided support to tourists who had been victimized by similar scams. He shared his story with anyone who would listen, not out of shame or embarrassment, but as a way of helping others recognize the warning signs he had missed. The most profound change, though, was in how Ethan began to understand himself and his own motivations. Working with a therapist who specialized in fraud victims, he began to explore not just what had happened to him, but why he had been so susceptible to manipulation in the first place. The loneliness following his divorce had been real, but it had also been compounded by deeper issues around self-worth and his need for external validation. The legal case concluded with significant prison sentences for the core members of the criminal network and substantial fines that would be used to compensate victims. Orasa herself received a lighter sentence in exchange for her cooperation with authorities. But Ethan never spoke to her again after that morning at the restaurant. There was nothing left to say between them. The woman he had thought he loved had never existed. When Ethan finally returned to Calgary, he was not the same man who had left 9 months earlier. The experience had been devastating, but it had also been transformative in ways he couldn't have anticipated. He had learned things about himself, about human nature, and about the complexity of emotional manipulation that would have been impossible to understand any other way. His friends and family were supportive but confused. They had difficulty understanding how someone as intelligent and business savvy as Ethan could have been so thoroughly deceived. But Ethan understood something they didn't. Intelligence and success provide no protection against emotional vulnerability. If anything, his confidence in his own judgment had made him more susceptible to sophisticated manipulation. He returned to running his logistics company, but with a different perspective on risk assessment and human psychology. He began speaking at business conferences about fraud prevention, helping other executives understand how personal vulnerabilities could be exploited in professional contexts. He also became involved with organizations that supported victims of romance fraud, providing both financial assistance and emotional support to people who had experienced similar betrayals. 6 months after returning home, something unexpected happened. Ethan met someone new, not in Thailand, not through some dramatic overseas adventure, but at a grief counseling group he had joined to help process the complex emotions surrounding his experience with Orasa. Her name was Margaret, and she was dealing with the death of her husband of 30 years. She was suspicious of Ethan's intentions when he first approached her, and he was grateful for that suspicion. It meant she was protecting herself in ways he had failed to protect himself. Their relationship developed slowly, carefully, with complete transparency about their past experiences and their fears about the future. Margaret had been warned by friends and family about the dangers of romance scams targeting widows, and she approached any new relationship with healthy skepticism. Ethan found this caution refreshing rather than insulting. He had learned to value protection over passion, honesty over intensity. They married 2 years later, in a simple ceremony attended by family and friends who had watched both of them navigate the complexities of starting over in middle age. It wasn't the dramatic movie-like romance that Ethan had experienced with Orasa. It was something better. It was real. Today, Ethan uses his experience to help others avoid similar situations. He works with law enforcement agencies to understand and combat romance fraud. He speaks to support groups for divorced men about the emotional vulnerabilities that can develop during major life transitions. Most importantly, he has learned to find value and purpose in his own life, rather than seeking validation through someone else's apparent need for him. The story of Ethan and Orasa isn't really a story about romance fraud, though that's certainly part of it. It's a story about human vulnerability, about the lengths people will go to feel needed and valued, and about how our deepest emotional needs can be weaponized by those who understand psychology better than we understand ourselves. But it's also a story about resilience, about the possibility of transformation even in the face of devastating betrayal, and about how sometimes the worst experiences of our lives can lead to the most profound personal growth. Ethan lost money, time, and his trust in his own judgment, but he gained something invaluable: a clear understanding of who he is, what he truly needs, and how to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than emotional dependency. If you've made it this far, I want you to do something for me. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, because stories like these matter and they need to be shared. More importantly, I want you to leave a comment telling me about your own experiences with trusting the wrong person, or about someone you know who might benefit from hearing Ethan's story. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where your emotions clouded your judgment? What red flags do you wish you had paid attention to in your own relationships? And if you're currently in a situation that's making you uncomfortable, if someone in your life is asking for money, or pushing for rapid intimacy, or trying to isolate you from friends and family, please reach out for help. There are resources available, people who understand what you're going through, and ways to protect yourself that don't require you to become cynical about human connection altogether. Ethan's story ended with genuine love and partnership, but it took nearly being destroyed by a counterfeit version of those things for him to recognize the real thing when it finally appeared. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give ourselves is the wisdom to tell the difference between someone who loves us and someone who simply knows how to make us feel loved. That difference can save more than just your money. It can save your life. Keep watching for more stories that matter. And remember, the best protection against deception isn't cynicism. It's knowledge, community, and the kind of self-awareness that comes from honest reflection on our own needs and vulnerabilities. Trust your instincts, verify what you can, and never be afraid to ask for help when something doesn't feel right. Your future self will thank you.